Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the next great session for today's Digital Virtual Health Series installment. My name is Stephen McCollum. I'm the Director of Programming and Healthcare Innovation, and I'm happy to have you with us today. Coming up, we have a really great fireside chat discussion on the impact of open source technology in healthcare and the benefits of open source technology in healthcare. Joining us, we have two esteemed professionals from our industry partners, IBM and Red Hat. So I'd like to welcome Ryan Hodgen with IBM and Atif Chogtai with Red Hat. Joining them is Mark Hagland, our editor-in-chief, for this great discussion. Please enter your questions for this discussion in the chat box that you see below the screen. We'll be managing all the questions via chat today, and I will see you in a few minutes after the session. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and welcome Ryan, Atif, and Mark.
Thanks so much, Stephen, for the great introduction, and welcome to all of you in our audience. We're so glad to have you with us. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to ask Ryan and Atif each to introduce themselves briefly, explain, give us their title and role within their organization. Ryan, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I'm Ryan Hodgen. I'm the Global Healthcare and Life Sciences CTO in IBM, and I work with our IBM teams as well as clients around the world to modernize their healthcare systems and get more value out of technology.
Perfect. And Atif?
Yeah, hey everyone, my name is Atif Chogtai. I lead the healthcare practice at Red Hat globally. I've been in the industry for about 25 plus years, had humble beginnings at National Institutes of Health and worked with various different payers and providers over my career. And I look at how open source can enable innovation and drive disruption into the healthcare industry.
Wonderful. Well, you're the perfect people to sit with together today. So thank you. Let's start with you, Ryan. Let me ask you the question. When we look at open source in the context of healthcare right now, and it's quite a large subject, but we'll try to bite off digestible bits. From your perspective, what hurdles need to be overcome to get us to where we need to be? And of course, with each question, I'm going to start with one person, but the other person is welcome and encouraged to respond. But I'll just start with you on this one, Ryan.
Sure. So I think when talking through the state of the industry, we have to look at what we have just gone through and are still really going through in the pandemic. That really, there's been so much disruption happening within healthcare right now, and a lot of heroics that have gone into weathering it. And that's true for our frontline healthcare providers, as well as the IT staff behind the scenes, enabling a lot of the systems that they depend on. That disruption has meant that we've run into some of the limitations of our existing systems, and it's really highlighted the need to improve them. It's also resulted in this massive shift more towards virtual care and the digital platforms that are available. And what we're seeing is there's really agreement that with so many patients and members now experiencing these platforms and these virtual forms of care, that'll continue even after the pandemic. There's now an expectation that those are options for care and a comfort level of using them that didn't exist before the pandemic. So with that in mind, we see then the need to change faster than there may have been a need to before, and the need to do that more in a broader community context than before as well, that there's more ecosystem partners, there's more of a dependence on organizations outside of the healthcare provider or the payer organization. And so the need to try to shift over into more of an open architecture and open model.
That makes total sense. Atif, go ahead. Yes, of course.
Yeah, so I'll just build on what Ryan said. Definitely agree with a need to shift towards open architecture and open model, but then it's actually having a better understanding by the enterprises, these hospital system or payers or life sciences, of what open source really is. I think oftentimes open source is equated with something, two guys in a basement on Friday night working, and it's not it. That's not it. And it's also actually a culture. Open source, we have to understand, it's a culture of collaboration, transparency, meritocracy, and a shared vision. And that actually overlaps very well with what healthcare culture is all about. If you put patient in the middle, member in the middle. So I would say under better understanding of the culture of open source, better understanding how really open source comes to be and how it's curated and made available for enterprises, and how it impacts actually also your financial models from moving from proprietary vendor license based to like, free but supported subscription based model, understanding of that as well.
Yeah, and fascinating insights from both of you, and I certainly agree. What's interesting is how healthcare has kind of its unique history, right, and culture. So in that regard, I'll start with you again, Ryan, and have both of you respond. How does pivoting to open source impact how technology and services are acquired by a healthcare organization, especially a patient care organization? Because there is real complexity there, correct?
Yeah, there is real complexity, and there's the history that you mentioned, that the existing systems and cultures, they weren't designed to be open. They were designed to maybe to protect data, to serve the clinicians, but maybe not the patient as the end user. And so with that, there's this transition that needs to happen. There was a recent Change Healthcare study that showed that nearly 90% of healthcare stakeholders believe that APIs are important to their business strategy, but only 24% are using them at scale today. And that shows the gap that we have between what is recognized to be an important part of strategy and an important priority, but yet the reality of what exists today, that there's a lot of change that goes into adopting APIs as the foundation to many of the open architectural elements that we look at. So there's a need for the open architecture. There's a need for open standards to be built on, to be able to integrate with different systems and different partners. And that leads then to an open ecosystem of organizations that are working together around common goals, which hopefully is something that really is of value to patients and to members that those organizations serve.
Yeah, absolutely. Atif, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think he covered it pretty comprehensively on this point. I don't think I really want to add anything to that.
Okay, great. So there are probably going to be some skeptics quietly watching in the background here. What makes open source good for healthcare? I mean, the culture of healthcare has made it almost a uniquely challenging culture for open source, I think. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But compared to other industries, we've tended to be very closed all along, right? The first EHRs were all closed systems, and then everyone realized, wow, that didn't work out. So we had to redo, and there had to be a complete second generation and third generation of EHRs. Data sharing has never been as robust in healthcare as in some other industries. Anyway, that's my little editorializing, since I'm an editor. So Atif, why don't you start? What makes open source appropriate for healthcare?
No, I think your editorial comments were spot on, right? And that's exactly what has happened with the healthcare industry. I think we all have to realize that healthcare data is very, well, first of all, it's regulated, the data around HIPAA, right? And regardless which country you're in, they have their own version. So that made everyone like, okay, we have to be very secure. Yeah. And back in then days, the immediate reaction was, okay, don't expose information when you don't need to. And they were, very blinders on, very narrow focus to what they knew what was best to do. However, with the evolution of technology and the disruption that the technology is bringing, now we are saying, hey, every other industry has gone through this disruption and evolution, except healthcare has always been laggard. And government had to come out, and US specifically, to put out mandates and carrots out there to get the healthcare to modernize and evolve. But what also is happening now on the payer side they're starting to reap the benefits of all this modernization that is taking place because it's per member per month cost for them is going down. They can do better wellness plan. They can do better population health plan. They know where to surgically point the care coordination team. All of that requires collaboration, requires transparency, requires information exchange. And that's where open source based standards, open source based approach make it easier to build that supply chain of care continuum that is transparent, secure, but sharing the right information at the right time. And if you look at the culture of open source, which I touched upon, it's exactly the same culture that healthcare has. So it's from a cultural perspective, it's a very good overlap because they're all focused on achieving a mission and an outcome, and which open source can enable. But we should be very careful. There is a difference between open source and supported open source. Supported open source is what I'm advocating, not pure upstream open source. Supported open source is there is an organization that has looked at the innovation that's happening in the community, is participating in that community, and then hardening that code, certifying it, making it available to the customer with the right documentation, security controls, upgrade, downgrade path. So it is consumable for an enterprise.
I see. That makes sense. And in just a moment, we're going to talk a little bit about security. So I think we'll want to touch on that again. Ryan, your thoughts on why open source is a good model for healthcare?
Yeah, well, I think Atif touched on some of the regulatory changes that are happening, and that is really what we're seeing as an instigator for organizations to take on interoperability and connecting systems that maybe hadn't been prioritized before, that there's more investment that's going into that work. But that means that it's not something that just one organization is doing. They're doing it in conjunction with a broader community of partners in some cases, or just following standards that have been formed from the US government, or there are other governments that are forming these as well, that then require more of that open collaboration happening within that group of organizations. And so I think what we're seeing is that the open source model that has been established and replicated over many different projects are now coming into the healthcare space around interoperability and some other topics. And we're able to then reuse a lot of the lessons learned that have happened on other open source initiatives now in the context of healthcare and some standards that are being formed around it.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you both. So let's talk about security and privacy concerns. What are the perceptions? What is the reality? And also, maybe we can distinguish between security and privacy, because they're related, but a bit different. Atif, would you like to go ahead and begin?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I would say, first of all, when we talk about open source, if you don't have experienced it before, it's not about going to some random website and downloading some bits and start using it. Okay, that's not how it really works. Open
and that probably is the perception, I have to say.
Yeah, and exactly.
Like
two guys in the basement, Friday night, hey, let's do this.
Yeah.
But it's not that. Open source actually by discipline it's a practice that actually organizations are using, looking at it as an organizational model to organize the companies, and using, instead of like the hierarchy model, or there's a couple other organization model that exists, which is like very relevant from a functionality concentration perspective. They're now looking at open source as a way to, hey, maybe we can get more efficiency out of our organization if we organize using open source model itself. Red Hat, which I'm part of, we live and breathe that model every day. We actually make our decisions meritocracy wise, and essentially provide continuous uplift and support to the supported open source. Now, specifically to your question about the security concerns, if you look at open source, starting with data, it's actually more secure. The reason it's more secure because you have not just only the person who wrote the code, but the members of the community. There's a different roles in the community, open source they play. They review it. Then company like Red Hat, who is essentially looking at that code, scanning that code with vulnerability tools, other state-of-the-art technology, and making sure there is no holes in there. Then we certify that code. And oftentimes, if we find a problem with the code, we might disable that feature till we can actually provide better fix for it. So from my perspective, open source is more secure, and it's actually proven out by the data that out there, number of defects versus number of unknown defects that were exploited by security in a proprietary software versus open source based software. So let's say that. Now on a privacy side, those are governmental control. Those are organizational controls. Controls from HIPAA perspective or controls from patient perspective, right? And nobody in open source world is saying like, hey, give me your healthcare data and I'll do something with it. Usually the data is synthesized. So yeah. I don't, I've heard this concern about privacy, but when you look one level below, when you have an organization like Red Hat that provides support for these open source tools, you don't need to share your PHI or PII data with Red Hat, right? That could be done. And we have organizations like IBM, who's partner of Red Hat and parent of Red Hat. They sign up to HIPAA and BAA all the time because they have the controls in place to make sure your privacy is guarded.
Okay. Ryan.
Yeah, I think that the privacy topic is a great one because we see so many regulations now around the use of data. In the US, there's HIPAA, and in Europe, it's GDPR, as well as some governance around how that data is actually used. And what I'd say is that what we see is really the need for those standards to be applied consistently and to be able to secure that data regardless of where it is, whether that's hosted within a provider's EMR system or on a mobile device that a patient is using. And so what I think is exciting about where we're headed is that there's more of these privacy standards that are coming out that apply to the use of the data regardless of where it exists. And what we see here is there is a need for some of that open source collaboration around those security topics around privacy, because HIPAA doesn't necessarily apply today if you take your own data and run it on you're using your own healthcare data on your mobile device. But there's a need for guidance, for education around how to secure that data regardless whether it exists. We think that the community model is a great way to do that and to share that across the entire healthcare landscape.
Okay, that makes great sense. Thank you. I'll turn back to you, Ryan, for the next question. Where can patient care organizations begin collaborating in this area? What's a good start for some?
Yeah, so I think the good news is that there really are some vibrant communities that have formed around many areas of interest in healthcare. Some good examples of that can be found in the FHIR Accelerator projects, the Karen Alliance, the Da Vinci Project, the Gravity Project. And what we see is that these are communities made up of really different types of stakeholders, research organizations, universities, hospitals, payers, and that's the type of interaction that's really healthy to see. And there are also then open source projects for specific areas of interest. IBM has open sourced some of our healthcare offerings. We have our FHIR server that's open source. Red Hat has projects like the Intelligent Data as a Service, their IDaaS project that's open source. And so there are some more point projects too that organizations can become involved in if they have an interest in that area.
Great. Tiff, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would say just share with something from Red Hat that might be valuable for folks who really want to start participating in this. Red Hat asks its employees, specifically of software engineers, to choose a project that they feel passionate about in the open source community and go participate in that and spend from 10 to 20% of their regular work hours in working in those projects and communities.
Yeah,
I think it's 20%, if I remember correctly. And they encourage that. because first of all, it makes our engineers understand what's happening in the community, but also sharpen their skills and also giving back to the community. So I would say like establishing a policy like that, where you encourage your employees to go contribute and work in these upstream community during regular hours is good. And there's benefits are there. Secondly, I would say start an open source community within your own organization, which is like a meetup group where you come together and work and build that culture locally in your organization, and then find a common area of interest like BPM Plus community, which is all about clinical workflows, right? All the doctors are actually sitting in there, and join communities like those and start exposing your organization to those.
Wonderful. Great advice. Thank you. Well, I'm going to turn back to you, Atif. What does the near-term future look like? And let's say 2 to 4 years. It sounds as though a lot might be about to happen. What are your thoughts? And then we'll go to Ryan.
Yeah, so I do think we are at a very pinnacle point in our history when it comes to healthcare. Healthcare was on a trajectory on an exponential growth from a disruption perspective before COVID. And COVID has shrunk that graph down, where now we are at the knee of the curve, where the next jump is going to be huge. Telemedicine and telehealth, we're all feeling it, it's touching it, right? The next step innovation that's going to happen is going to affect almost all of us, where either it could be AI ML while we're interacting with the physician through our computer, is looking at facial expressions and body and eye language or whatever, and making assertions on the health wellness of my mental state, or am I telling the truth or not. Different applications can be coming. So I think there's going to be a lot more innovation and disruption going to happen. And with COVID, the genie's out of the bottle. The telehealth and IT, becoming that center stage. I do think also the open source will play a major role in that, because as we have more options for care, to receive care, we have also the needs to share those data now. We have the need to actually assess that data and intelligently organize it. And that's where some organizations, like big hospital system, when they build these capabilities, now they are selling that capability to the market, to other providers, even their competitors, because they are looking at this as a way of generating new revenue stream. And open source, again, is right at the middle of it, because it provides the most flexibility to organizations.
Wonderful. Yeah. Ryan.
Yeah, so I agree with Atif on the disruption theme, that I think even though we're coming out of a time of disruption from a pandemic, there likely will be continued disruption afterwards. Hopefully it looks take a different form, and we're not dealing with a pandemic or a disease like we've had with COVID-19, but it may actually take now the form of more outside competition. We're seeing the largest quarter of venture capital for digital health was completed in the first quarter of 2021. And so there's obviously outside investment that's coming in to really further these digital healthcare options. We also are seeing the regulatory pressure come from the different governmental systems, as well as different customer demands. So as a patient or a member, my expectations now of the system may be different than they were 12 months ago. And so with that disruption, there's a need to modernize the systems or the experiences around those systems, and that can take different forms. But I think what it means is that we're seeing a really exciting time in the industry where there's going to be innovation, there's going to be work happening, and change is happening faster than what we have seen in the past. And hopefully the outcome of that is better experiences for members and patients, and better outcomes as well.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thank you. I'm going to close by asking both of you, and whoever would like to respond first, any pieces of advice to leave with our audience, because clearly you both see the enormous potential here, and have explained well some of the misunderstandings and misapprehensions about open source. So what would your advice for our audience be? Remember that many in our audience are CIOs, CTOs, CMIOs, and others who work with them in the clinical and operational informatics areas.
I'll go first. I will say, like, you probably have all gotten a good flavor of open source from this talk, hopefully. One of the things that I did not mention previously that would be extremely valuable is this whole shift from CapEx to OpEx. Open source, being a subscription model, actually really alleviates some of your budget constraints, which requiring CapEx investments upfront, and move you towards an OpEx where you pay a yearly subscription, just almost like Netflix, which is monthly, but you can pay yearly, right? And that has actually helped our customers now suddenly be able to find breathing room in terms of their commitment, financial commitment, while they're trying to innovate. Because they have to keep the lights on and at the same time, provide the next best thing. And so I would say, like, when you are looking at open source, keep that in mind, because of that financial flexibility and portability to any cloud or any environment might be a strategic advantage for you that you want to avail.
Wonderful. Ryan?
Yeah, so there's a proverb I've been reflecting on a lot lately that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think this is a time where we really have to go together as an industry, that there are so many changes that are happening that we'll work through those best together as an open community. And what I would encourage listeners is look at what that means for your organization, that how can you best leverage what we have happening in the open source world and the open source communities to be able to partner with you in the work that you're doing and the transformation that's happening.
Wonderful. So Atif Choktai and Ryan Hodgen, thank you both. You've shared so much expertise and so many insights with our audience. I know we appreciate it very much, and I appreciate very much our discussion just now. And I'm going to turn it back to Stephen, who will magically reappear. Thank you both.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, Atif, and Ryan. That was such a great conversation. I hope all of the attendees enjoyed it just as much as I did. As a reminder, don't forget to join us for our last session at 3 p.m. It has to do with how IT leaders are managing the workforce of the future. We've got a lot of great conversation included in it, including discussions on DEI, including discussions on return to work, including discussions on how technology is being deployed in IT workforces to help improve efficiencies. It's just going to be great all around and a wonderful way to wrap up the day. So we'll see you all right back here at 3 o'clock. Thank you again to our sponsors, IBM and Red Hat, for this session. Don't forget to check out the event page where you can see additional information about all of our companies. Thank you all again. See you soon.